All right, welcome back after that session where we announced what we think will be a pivotal moment for the entire industry. We have yet another wonderful panel here for you on day 5 of the Smart Protein Summit. And this panel actually may be something that typifies, or this topic may be something that typifies exactly what we're trying to do here with the summit. COVID-19 has given us the opportunity, as we've discussed many, many times, to take a step back and think about how we want to approach development and food over the next 10 years. Our panelists on this in this particular session can speak with great authority to the work that they are doing to transform food systems towards being more resilient and reducing the risk of things like pandemics and climate change. I'm not going to offer a large preamble here or a long preamble here because I really want to get our wonderful panelists on as soon as possible. So I'll get started with introducing Christine Gould. Christine, thank you so much for joining us. Christine is founder and CEO at Thought for Food, a major and very cool platform for food system transformation. As an example, Thought for Food has helped launch 60 plus startups that have collectively raised over $200 million and created a community of over 20,000 millennials and Gen Z participants on their platform. Christine has spent her career in agriculture, including at Syngenta and leadership positions at multi-billion-dollar global companies and startup unicorns around the world. She has been awarded a UN Global Champion and Ashoka Changemaker, among several other accolades that we'll talk about. Christine, welcome to the Smart Protein Summit.
It's so great to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and introduce Rosie Waddle. She's program director at the Jeremy Collar Foundation, heading up the foundation's strategic programs, including the FAIR initiative, working with major investors with combined assets of $25 trillion, that's trillion with a T, to put factory farming on the responsible investment agenda. Rosie also acts as an investment associate at CPT Capital, which invests in the food technology space, including past investments in companies you may have heard of, like Memphis Meats, Perfect Day, and Good Catch. Rosie holds a BA and MA from the University of Oxford and an MA from the Courtauld Institute. Rosie, welcome.
Thank you, Varun. Delighted to be here.
Pleasure to have you. And finally, Lisa Sweet from the World Economic Forum. She's been with the World Economic Forum since 2011 and is currently the head of their Future of Protein initiative, as well as their COVID response and food and health groups. She has also headed a number of their other initiatives in the past. Lisa was formerly an associate director at the United States Olympic Committee, prior to which she worked in finance at Lehman Brothers. She has a BA in political science from Yale and an MBA in marketing from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. Lisa, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really thrilled to be a part of this.
All right, let's go ahead and let's kind of dive right into it. I'm going to start with you, Christine. Thought for Food, as I said, is a very, very interesting organization, almost defies categorization or definition. It's a platform and an ecosystem for food innovation and food system reform, very much a key part of the global shift in how careers in food are viewed, which is to say more sexy in this generation than in the previous generation. How would you explain what you do in a couple of minutes?
Sure. Yeah, Thought for Food is a global organization that is really dedicated to shaking up this age-old industry of food and agriculture. We started 8 years ago, before there was a lot of interest in the investment community and the startup community in this sector. And what we've seen is that the tide has been rising, and we've been rising with that tide. But what we're bringing to the table is really new mindsets and approaches about how to innovate with purpose and impact. So as you mentioned, we're working with almost 30,000 innovators in 175 countries, and we specifically target millennials and Gen Zs because they are bringing kind of a new value system into the food system. And, that is transforming things. And they're some of the biggest consumers of protein alternatives, and also thinking about how to innovate in this sector beyond what incumbents are thinking about. So what we do is really support them, accelerate their ideas and innovations, provide investment and pre-seed and seed funding to the startups that they develop. And I guess we'll get into more later about some of the exciting insights and trends that I see emerging, but that's kind of what we are at a high level.
Thank you. And would you actually please tell everyone about your own summit or your event that's coming up on World Food?
Yeah, I do think you're right. Like, we are bringing, kind of that sexy factor to food and ag. So on World Food Day, October 16th, we have our TFF, the 2020 Challenge finale. It's a star-studded extravaganza celebrating the next generation, frontline heroes. We have 10 teams that were selected from 5,200 entrants from around the world. They've been working with us for the past year to accelerate their startups. They're going to be showcasing their pitches and kind of documentary style films. We have DJ performances. We have speakers from the United Nations, from Danone, from Monster Cat Records. And if you're interested, I can tell you what the affiliation is with Food and Ag. It's going to be really, really exciting, just what 2020 needs. And of course, we will be exploring alternative proteins, because that is very key to, the innovation future in this sector. So check it out, thoughtforfood.org.
Thank you, Christine. And
thanks for letting me promo it.
EFI India is also delighted to be a partner to that.
Yes,
so thank you so much. Okay, Rosie, you're involved with a couple of really fantastic, I would say, pivotal organizations driving catalytic investment in alternative protein, the FAIR Initiative, and CPT Capital. And you're also driving a shift in investment, or a diversification in investment away from factory farming, respectively, right? So it's a fascinating kind of dual role, which gives you a very interesting vanguard into this transformation. Would you please describe what this looks like from the inside?
Of course, thanks, Varun. And first to say what a great summit it's been so far. So really kudos to you and the whole GFI team. So just to give some context on my dual role, as you mentioned, Varun. So I work for a private equity investor called Jeremy Collar, who pioneered the private equity secondaries market in the early 1990s. And as well as being obviously a very successful investor, Jeremy also happens to be passionate about sustainable food systems, and he's actually been vegetarian since he was about 11 years old. So when I joined 7 years ago as kind of the first employee of Jeremy's foundation, we started thinking about how, alongside a more traditional philanthropy approach, I guess, and grant making, which is obviously part of what we do, but how could we essentially take a more strategic approach and work within the capital markets and with the capital markets to influence a shift towards more sustainable food systems. And that kind of thought process is essentially where the two separate organizations, FAIR and CPT Capital, developed from. So to talk about FAIR first, FAIR is a global institutional investor network. We launched it 5 years ago as an initiative of the foundation, and it's been the fastest growing investor network globally in that time. As you mentioned, it now represents more than $25 trillion of combined assets. So these are many of the large pension funds, insurance companies, and asset managers globally who join up as members of the FAIR network. And we work with these investors to educate them on the material risks or financial risks that are posed by animal protein supply chains. And we look kind of across the whole spectrum of risks. So from, environmental factors like greenhouse gas emissions to social factors like public health impacts. We also look at impacts like animal welfare, for instance. And with FAIR, we aim to help investors really understand these risks, and then in turn help those investors to engage with their own portfolio companies. And this is kind of across the whole food value chain, to kind of inspire, I guess, a shift to better practices. So these investors that we work with own stocks in all of the big publicly listed food companies globally, from the large producers, whether it be, Tyson and JBS, Venky's in India, to the big consumer facing companies from CPGs like General Mills, retailers such as Tesco, or even restaurant chains like McDonald's. So our aim here is really to shift all of these big incumbent food companies to more sustainable practices through engagement with this investor network, and bring together as big a group of investors as possible to do that and exert that influence. And to talk briefly about the CPT Capital side, this is a kind of completely separate entity to FAIR, but through this entity, we are investing in early stage alternative protein companies. And when we started looking at the space 7 years ago, there was kind of a real lack of good products available for mainstream flexitarian consumers. So, and also at that point, there was much less investment interest from venture capitalists compared to what we're seeing today. So we wanted to support the space through kind of impact investing. Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods were our first two investments back in 2014. And since then, we've built out a kind of strategic investment approach, looking at the three core technology verticals that GFI covers, so plant-based, recombinant proteins, and cell culture too. So although these CPT and FAIR are kind of two separate entities, they are both, as you said, Varun, really trying to influence capital flows to build more sustainable food systems and encourage a shift to alternative proteins. And all of this, obviously, we hope will help to build more sustainable, resilient protein supply chains going forwards.
Thank you. And by the way, to get a sense of the momentum with which FAIR is working with investors, Lisa's bio that she sent to me said $19 trillion, but the correct figure today is $25 trillion. So, your bio must be a couple of months out of date, and it's now 25 billion.
It's growing very fast.
Yeah. Okay, so sorry, Rosie's bio is what I meant, but I'm going to go ahead to Lisa. The World Economic Forum has played a key role in getting important corporations and investors to think about alternative protein very seriously through your Future of Protein initiative and other work that you're doing. And you're really at the center of this work in your role. So what is the scope of activities you're undertaking currently with the Future of Protein initiative?
Thanks, Varun. And I love being a part of this panel because I feel like the three of us combined really speak to very different elements of the protein ecosystem and the spaces that need to be working together even more than we do so now. So, but I think these panels are always great because not only do you get the opportunity to talk about some of the work, but you get the opportunity to meet different stakeholders that you might not be working with already and form those collaborations. At the World Economic Forum for the Future of Protein work, we're really doing three different activities. And we started the work about 2 years ago. It was really focused on developing a set of new knowledge tools that were looking at how fit for purpose the protein ecosystem was to deliver on the protein needs of 2050. We put together a series of reports that we then launched, and what was critical in these reports was that we were really tackling the issue of protein from multiple lenses and looking at the multiple benefits that different ecosystems, such as alternative proteins or different pathways to change the protein system, could have impacts on a range of different issue areas. So oftentimes, and kind of, you see people coming into the alternative protein space from a particular issue area. I care particularly about animal welfare, or I care about the environmental impact. But the beautiful thing about alternative proteins, if you do them right and depending on how they develop, is they can hit and really trigger on multiple benefits, not just the environmental ones, but also the health ones, livelihoods, inclusivity, accessibility, so on and so forth. And we really sought to raise awareness of the power of transforming protein systems to deliver across multiple benefits. The next focus that we really had was around linking the protein ecosystem to a range of different agendas. So thinking through how protein affects the oceans, thinking through how protein affects livelihoods, thinking through how protein affects nature, and bringing insights and different levels of awareness about how changes in the protein ecosystem could benefit these different systems. And now we're really moving into a phase of action. And I caught the tail end of your last panel, and I was really thrilled to hear the conversations around action, because that's ultimately where the rubber hits the road and where we're going to see these key transformation drivers. So we're working across three different pathways. One is around acceleration and advancement of alternative proteins. One is around changes to the current animal-based production systems to make them much more sustainable in the past. And then the third is around consumer behavior change. And here we're really bringing different stakeholders together to create collaborations that can showcase these theories and the the hopes that we have around these different areas and put them into practice on the ground.
Thank you, Lisa. So I'm going to jump again now to the elephant in the room, what we're kind of here to discuss to a certain extent. COVID-19 is the major question at hand. institutions around the world have identified a need for a more resilient post-pandemic food system. So the World Economic Forum, for example, says we need a great reset across all of these things, whether it's food or climate or energy, or all of these things, right? So in order to get to better stewardship of human and planetary health, Rosie, I would say this is a pivotal moment for FAIR's focus on environmental sustainability, corporate governance, investing. We've talked throughout the summit about animal protein's role in public health issues, but I'm going to throw it to you now to just frame the problem once again. Would you please provide the audience a recap of why it creates and exacerbates these risks?
Yeah, absolutely. And as background, I mean, the health-related risks stemming from animal protein production has been a very strong focus for FAIR from the very beginning. And that's really because, exactly as you said, Varun, when you look at these risks and the corresponding financial impacts, of course, they're really just so stark when you look at the sector. So FAIR's flagship engagement initiative was actually with 20 global restaurant chains on antibiotic resistance, or AMR. And AMR is quite a terrifying example, really, of how animal protein production poses real human health risks. And so to kind of overview that, I mean, it's estimated that 70% of all antibiotics globally are used on farm animals rather than humans. This is because it's common practice in intensive livestock production to routinely, literally every day, feed animals low levels of antibiotics in feed or water, essentially as a preventative measure, really, to keep them healthier and allow them to live in the confined conditions of a factory farm. And in terms of the human consequences of that, we all know that rising antibiotic resistance is a massive problem for human health. Actually, one of the biggest public health challenges of our time, or obviously now COVID has overshadowed that, but going forwards, it absolutely will be. And antibiotics are essentially becoming useless as bacteria develop resistance to these drugs, and it's leaving many diseases, pneumonia, tuberculosis, for instance, completely untreatable. We've already got, hundreds of thousands of deaths worldwide each year today due to AMR, and that's expected to get much, much worse. The UK government estimates it will kill 10 million people annually by 2050 if it's not addressed. And translating that to economic impact, we're talking about $100 trillion of lost global output by 2050 if we don't address this. So these are clearly huge numbers. And the other public health angle, obviously shifting to look at the kind of zoonotic disease risk side. Of course, COVID, as we know, is a zoonotic disease. But before COVID, the animal production industry was already battling several really endemic and re-emerging infectious diseases. Some of these have affected humans, like avian flu and swine flu. Some of them haven't, like African swine fever, but irrespective, all of these have had a huge financial impact on the industry and posed a real risk to human health. Just to give one example, I mean, last year, a quarter of the world's pigs, it's estimated, an unbelievable number, were estimated to be killed or culled as a result of African swine fever. And that's driven a massive increase in pork prices and really affected the market. So, I mean, looking back to COVID, we, of course, know this pandemic isn't a one-off. The next deadly pandemic may well come from a factory farm. Why would that be? Well, we know that the animal production systems that we use today, they're not only vulnerable to pandemics, as we've seen illustrated by COVID and the issues with the meat supply chain in the US and kind of more broadly, but those types of systems do also create them. The CDC and the FAO estimate 3 in 4 emerging infectious diseases in humans are coming from animals, and increasingly these are coming from livestock. And it is basically, I mean, the nature of intensive animal production. Think of the high stocking densities, indoor confinement, chronic stress for the animals, lowered immunity, live transport. All of this together means they're really ideal environments for deadly diseases to mutate and spread very rapidly. So from our perspective, I mean, if a highly deadly strain of avian or swine flu were to become highly transmissible between humans, we would be facing the next pandemic from a factory farm. So the risks here really are couldn't be starker, essentially.
Yeah, and in fact, if we look at low and middle income countries, which is a significant focus of, I guess, this summit, a lot of the work we do at GFI India, they tend to bear the greatest burden of general foodborne disease. So if you look at reports from GAIN, the Global Alliance for Infant Nutrition, we have this creaking infrastructure, these issues with regulation. Regulators are overburdened. It's very difficult to keep a track on the supply chain and make sure that you're not getting these risks in the supply chain. So during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, I mean, during this entire year, there have been multiple instances of avian flu outbreaks in India where birds have been culled. It creates a lot of risk in terms of health of humans, but also, as you said, economic risks to the farmers, etc. It's something that we have to think about as a risk of the underlying animal protein production platform. So moving now to Christine, and kind of thinking more about these supply chain disruptions, you're in touch with a wide swath of actors across the food system, including farmers, or perhaps especially farmers. Now, supply chain and demand shocks have been very pronounced during COVID-19, as I mentioned. Many farmers have needed to dump chickens in India or cull them, as I just said, for reasons of avian flu. What have been some of these major disruptions to the food supply you've seen during the pandemic, and what has made us susceptible to these?
Yeah, I think that the silver lining for those of us who've dedicated our careers to food and agricultural transformation of the COVID, pandemic has been this increased awareness, right, about the fragility of our food systems and the fact that we need to build solutions that are systemic in nature, right? We have to look at climate change, water, biodiversity, health and nutrition, and food security as part of one shared challenge and not as separate issues to solve. So this has been something that, we've always championed and believed in its heightened awareness and like the world, and particularly with policymakers and business, which has been, helpful. And now what I think we need to move towards is designing new types of solutions, right? And so these types of solutions need to be what we call multispectral in nature. That is, they need to be systemic, and they need not just to solve the immediate problems at hand, but actually look towards these like broader, issues that I mentioned. So for example, one of the great things that's happened from COVID-19 is there's been an increased interest in plant-based protein alternatives. And we've seen more people in more places, especially in emerging economies, saying that recognizing all of those issues that Rosie pointed out, right, around industrial production of meat and looking towards health and nutrition from plants, and how this can be achieved with new types of food products. Now, what do we have to do differently? It's not just as easy as saying we're going to, eat plant-based proteins. We actually need to be looking at how we can do this better than ever before. And so we need to look at new types of crops and not perpetuating monocultures, right, that have destructive impacts on the environment. Just because it's plant doesn't mean that it's necessarily environmentally friendly, right? How do we also build circular and inclusive business models that are regenerating ecosystems, that are empowering communities, and particularly smallholder farmers, and that are designing out waste, which is a huge problem, especially when you're looking at plant-based crops, because they're highly perishable in many cases. So it's, some of these like topics we have the chance to really think in new ways and in different ways. And then to your point about like supply chain disruptions, I mean, this has also been exciting for those of us at TFF because we're working with digital natives who've been really thinking about how we can connect, producers and consumers in using data and digital technology. And we actually launched something at TFF called the COVID Collaboration Collective, which a lot of our team started open sourcing their APIs because they were like doing this kind of consumer and farmer connectivity in Colombia, for example. And then they were seeing similar problems in India and saying, hey, we can help accelerate the impact of your startup. Here's some, API you can like integrate into your solution, et cetera. So we've been fostering more collaboration between early stage startups around the world to really make sure that we can see positive impact more quickly. And I think these are like some of the positive learnings and lessons and new approaches that we have the chance to take more advantage of in this post-COVID world.
Yeah, it's very exciting. And Christine, thank you for that. I'm gonna just go ahead and throw a couple of questions to Lisa now, and you can take time to answer them, Lisa. We've talked about this kind of great reset. We've talked about cognizance across the food system for a need to transition away from these intensive systems. Firstly, I have a question about kind of what role alternative protein plays within that great reset writ large. And then secondly, my question is about kind of building multi-stakeholder partnerships across the food system. What interest have you seen from the major organizations in your network? And could you describe the kinds of collaborations that you feel are needed to drive scale and adoption in alt protein?
Sure. So it's interesting coming after Christine, because I have a slightly different take on what's happening in COVID. And you particularly mentioned that there's an increased interest in plant-based proteins. I think in terms of the Great Reset and in terms of what we're seeing now for that increased interest in plant-based proteins, I don't think we know enough, because COVID has been so unique in some of the disruptions that it's brought into the food system, to really understand which of these trends are in for the long haul. That being said, I think we're seeing kind of some very interesting things happening with regard to people's awareness of the food system overall. I think some of the disruptions that we have seen, particularly where huge amounts of product were thrown away throughout the food systems, has really raised the world's awareness around food systems and their fragility, and brought that center stage in conversations that governments are having, that businesses are having, that technology is having, that a whole range of different stakeholders are having. And so in terms of the Great Reset, I think what we're seeing and what we have a number of stakeholders advocating for is really to put the transition of agriculture and the evolution of agriculture front and center in recovery plans for governments, as they go from a crisis mentality within COVID to thinking about how they build back better and how they build back stronger. I think the other thing that COVID has really exacerbated is what a fundamental shock to the system looks like. And this has really brought home what we've been talking about for many years around the expected and anticipated disruptions that will be caused by climate change in the coming years. This was a precursor to that, and it came from a different lens and a different angle, but it really drilled home the fact that these types of disruptions are going to become endemic to all of our systems going forward. And so how do we think differently, use our tools differently, collaborate differently going forward? Technology is a huge part of that, as Christine has mentioned. But the other side to that, I think, is this greater awareness of climate change and the climate repercussions of today's food systems. And I think there's been some exciting developments or the starts of collaborations, discussions around carbon labeling in the food systems in Europe taking place, discussions around traceability that are taking place, and how do you help farmers and bring an ecosystem of support to make them more sustainable in countries like Zambia, for instance. So you're seeing these kind of disruptions in this new way of thinking and these new models really accelerated because of COVID. I think the types of collaborations that we need across the system need to be multi-stakeholder at their core. They need to bring together the different actors to really understand what the challenges are from different perspectives, and to be able to respond and create solutions that can cater to those. I think we need to be looking at collaborations that don't just talk about the transformation that's needed, but actually help to put in place the transitions that it will take to get there, of which the finance part of the equation is really a tremendous one. And I think I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then I think the innovation space is really a huge, tremendous one that requires a lot of support from a lot of different actors. And really, it requires people, Christine, I think you mentioned it earlier, thinking with new mindsets. It's really about kind of taking yourself out of this kind of very insular track of what innovation is, and working with others and collaborating to understand what those critical roadblocks are and how collectively a group can come together to unblock them.
Thank you, Lisa. And we totally agree that this kind of multi-stakeholder, almost multi-decade partnership approach will be needed if we're going to effect this diversification. We're talking about these huge, deeply entrenched systems to build back better, which is why we're kind of excited about the the industry forum, a lot of different things that we're doing in India as well. I'm going to go now to Rosie. The entrepreneurs in whom you invest with CPT Capital have also had disruptions. Many may have needed capital to tide them through this period. Many larger players in R&D, manufacturing, distribution could help those entrepreneurs. It could be make or break to partner with them for early stage firms during this period. Have you seen any sort of strategy reorientation on the innovation side that Lisa was just talking about?
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen changes in strategy from our startups and the kind of broader early stage ecosystem, I guess, as a result of the pandemic. The obvious example in terms of like a very quick strategy change is, of course, the companies who were focused on food service and restaurant partnerships and have had those channels essentially completely wiped out overnight. Some of our own portfolio companies on the CPT side have had to very quickly pivot to retail and direct consumer channels. And that's, of course, not merely a question of finding those new retail partners or simply setting up, D2C channels online. There's many other changes and challenges required in that. I mean, just to give two perhaps obvious examples, I don't know, but products have to be optimized for preparation by the consumer at home in those settings. You need completely different packaging and information for those channels. It's not a simple shift of just switching partners, I guess, but we've been very pleased to see, many of our companies have navigated that successfully, and they'll keep those channels online as food service hopefully recovers. Let's see, but definitely on the retail side, given the disruptions that were obvious in the meat supply chain, especially in the kind of early stages of COVID when there was issues with the meat packing plants, and something like 50% of all slaughterhouse capacity in the US was impacted. Those retail companies were obviously looking for partners who could give different options to put on the shelves. In terms of your question around the capital requirements to tide companies over, yeah, that's definitely true. Many of the earlier stage companies in the space have been raising additional capital as convertible notes or bridge rounds, for example, to give them extra cash in the bank and a longer runway to navigate the period. Of course, it's quite difficult for these companies as we just don't know how long we'll be dealing with this. So we as CPT are kind of encouraging our companies to be cautious and take cash when they can to help see them through. But to be honest, I mean, I've been very encouraged to see that this current situation and the kind of broader market impacts haven't seemed to have had an impact on cash coming into this space and venture capital investment. According to the data we have and reports by GFI, for instance, recently, investment levels are keeping pace with last year, which is encouraging. And on an individual company level, what we're seeing is the companies we're working with are not struggling to bring in cash and actually are seeing more investment interest than ever before, probably because of the, again, the kind of growing awareness of some of the issues with the current supply chain and potential benefits for alternative proteins. So that gives me kind of reason to be hopeful that a positive outcome of this terrible crisis will be, exactly as been said before, an acceleration for the sector, an increasing influx of capital, which will enable real transformation. But we will have to wait and see, as Lisa said, how many of these trends are kind of for the longer term rather than just temporary.
Wonderful, thanks. So I think we have a few minutes left. I'm going to do a final round of questions and just ask that you keep your answers to just a couple of minutes. Firstly, Christine, we've talked about collaborations. Thought for Food is something of a magical engine for collaboration. We've also talked about how governments and even multilateral institutions should be thinking about a great reset or building back better and being a key piece of that, right? You're also advising the UN Food System Summit next year. Could you tell us what kind of collaborations you're seeing that are promising for the future of our food system and a more resilient one? And then what transformations are you hoping will emerge from this time, say from the summit? Yeah.
I mean, collaboration is completely my obsession. In fact, I have a book coming up next month about collaboration in food and ag, uncommon collaboration. So we could have a whole session just on this topic. So a couple of things that I'll mention that excite me. One is around the breeding of new crops, right, for this space. And I think that there's some really exciting momentum, even like collaborations between the breeding community and vertical farming systems and people exploring interplanetary living, about, you know, all kinds of new crops with all kinds of new properties and nutritional profiles that could really feed into this sector. I'm also excited about technifying underutilized crops. So there's this whole plethora, 7,000 crops that humans can be consuming that have like no breeding programs, no agronomic programs applied to them beyond just like kind of subsistence smallholder farmers. So I think that what we're trying to do at Thought for Food is incentivize, you know, young people around the world who know these crops in different localities to jump in and bring their, you know, new approaches, new mindsets, and digital understanding to really develop high productivity, you know, and new business models that can make these mainstream. I think like there's collaboration with new sectors such as like telecoms and social media, right? That's already showing big potential. Like we've seen that happen in COVID times. WhatsApp is now being used as like a main tool, right, for farmers to sell their crops, and getting those players involved. That's something I'm working with the UN right now, is like, how do we get new types of organizations and companies, not just the food and ag incumbents, into developing solutions. And I mentioned, you know, we have Monster Cat Records speaking at our event next Friday, and people are like, what does EDM have to do with feeding the world? Well, they have disrupted an entire industry, the music industry, with their unconventional approach to having a completely open licensing approach for their artists. And I really think that there's a lot to learn too in the IP strategies that we adopt going forward to really catalyze innovation in this sector. And so I'm trying to connect unexpected dots from completely disparate industries, such as music, such as software, such as electronics, and saying, what can we learn about what they've done to really catalyze collaborative innovation, right, to make these kind of new technologies really, you know, more available to people around the world. So those are some of the exciting collaboration opportunities I see, and really are trying to get, you know, new innovation around not just the tech side of things, but how we innovate in our mindset and our collaboration. And one really quick last point about the trend, I completely agree with both Rosie and Lisa about the fact that we have to see what's going to happen post-COVID. But one trend that has existed before COVID came about was young people demanding plant-based alternatives. So this kind of like millennial and Gen Z demand was there before COVID. It's now seemingly being accelerated by, you know, the pandemic, but I believe that this is a trend that is here to stay based on the kind of demands of today's young people all around the world.
Thank you, Christine. So Rosie and then Lisa, I'm going to ask a final question to you both. Governments and, you know, on the regulatory side and research side, governments are going to be critical to this. What do you see as opportunities for R&D funding, regulatory support over the next years for alternative proteins? Rosie, would you like to go first?
Sure. So yeah, I mean, clearly, as you say, there's quite an unusual policy window opening here in response to the pandemic, with regulators having to consider how to kind of best prevent and mitigate the next crisis, or as Lisa said, these global shocks, which are becoming more endemic. I mean, in terms of kind of specific guidance for expedited processes for new technologies, I haven't heard of anything like that yet, which could be compared to what's happening with biomedicine and vaccines. But in talking to our portfolio companies who are working on some of the more cutting edge technologies like cell culture, it does seem like the kind of relevant regulatory agencies in various jurisdictions are continuing to make themselves very available for discussions on, you know, how these products could be regulated or should be regulated, and are definitely making the connections between the benefits that these technologies could bring and developing a more resilient, robust supply chain that's more kind of resistant to these types of shocks. We also know, obviously, that, you know, for the broader food sector and sustainable development more generally, there are regulatory conversations taking place across Europe, for example, which touch on these themes and kind of highlight key core topics, I guess. We've heard about some of these initiatives and partnerships throughout the whole summit, but one example is obviously the European Green Deal and the Farm to Fork strategy, which is part of that. And at a high level, that will aim to set out both regulatory and non-regulatory funding initiatives, for instance, to support a more sustainable system. Alternative proteins is a core focus of that. So those types of initiatives, I think, represent a real step forward in terms of both the R&D funding side, but also regulatory support. And I hope we'll start to see more tangible outcomes of those initiatives in the near term.
Lisa, 30 seconds on the clock before it cuts you off.
Well, Rosie did an excellent job. I mean, I think the thing that I'm going to mention is a new platform that we're launching, which is called Uplink. And Uplink is really intended to connect the innovators and the ideators around the world with those who can make global change happen because of the size, scale of their impact. So think the big companies, think the big governments, so on and so forth. The protein and the alternative protein ecosystem needs a lot of nuance. It needs to respond to what's happening in particular regions, certain parts of India, Thailand, Kenya, for instance, all have very different protein needs, protein ecosystems, protein trajectories, and we want to bring the power of the network of everybody who's excited around this together to help create those nuanced solutions for different regions.
Lisa, Rosie, Christine, thank you so much for joining us at the Smart Protein Summit. Pleasure to have you.